Pleasure to
Yes.
address your fans here, and I appreciate the introduction. And I have a slide presentation to you for you tonight to really sort of talk about the range of benefits that ketones can provide you. This is a standard disclaimer I use. It just tells you that some of the things I may talk about are off-label. They certainly aren't any particular recommendations, and this is for educational purposes. This is going to be mainly a talk about more than just the issues of weight loss, which is a very popular topic for probably the last 7 to 10 years. But I'm going to really talk about some of my research over the past decade related to ketones. Let's see. Oh, it's not advancing. Why is it? Let me see. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, whoops, let me back up. I did come from academic research. I spent the better part of 30 years as an HIV researcher and hepatitis B and C researcher. I helped develop some of the initial drugs. I worked at the NIH, and I've been consultant to a variety of companies in terms of understanding viral kinetics and organ transplantation and T cell function and immunity. I guess I'm known for two things. One is I was one of the early people to sequence the genome of HIV and correlate amino acid changes to drug resistance to develop a simplified um, guide for the treatment of HIV that actually allowed people to be able to effectively treat the disease without these $1 million sequencing machines and T cell enumeration machines. And the other thing is that I was very instrumental in the discovery and the treatment of HIV-related dementias. So I have a fair amount of understanding about neurodegenerative diseases. So with that in mind, I'm going to sort of begin, and hopefully my slide deck will work correctly here. But when we look at the history of sort of feeding and energetics in the body, some early studies done in the 1970s looked at animals, 100 different species, and they basically came to the conclusion that we all share not just similar ways of generating energy, but actually bioidentical ways of generating energy. That is, it doesn't matter whether you're a tiger, a bear, a killer whale, or a chimpanzee. If you're a warm-blooded carnivorous animal, you're burning 35 kcals per kilogram per day, and the production of ATP is universal. And this is actually probably related to some of the way the cells developed from a prokaryocyte in the so-called primordial soup 3 billion years ago to the current um, cell, the eukaryocyte, which is a actual blend of the nuclear material of your parents and the nuclear material of your mother stored in a bacteria called the mitochondria, which is the um, power cell of cells. Okay, let's see how we go here. Okay, so when in the following this, there was a study looking at how animals eat. And they went out and they took wolves and they attached a ketone meter and a glucose meter and a GPS device at birth. And they followed them out in the wild. And these are not like wolves that live near a city, but way out in the middle of nowhere. And they followed them out until the GPS indicated they had died. And then they went and harvested the carcass and then did autopsies. And what did they find? They found that when the animals died, they removed out of the study those that had gotten eaten by by another animal, those that died of an infectious disease, and those that died of an accident, fell in a hole, got burned in a forest fire, or some accident. And then they fully autopsied the remaining ones, and lo and behold, they found that 90% of those animals had no evidence of disease. Now, 10% actually had diseases: cancer, thyroid disease, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes, strokes, etc. And but 90% had none. And then when they looked at the percentage of time that these animals lived in off of ketones versus those that lived off of glucose or sugar, it was fascinating. It was 60 to 80% of the time they were living on ketones, and 20 to 40% of the time they were living on sugar. And if you actually did, by meta-analysis, a study on Americans, you would find that uh, in a typical morgue, 90% of Americans die of disease, and 10% actually die with no evidence of disease, quote unquote, old age or mechanical failure. And to that extent, when you look at the time that they live in ketosis, it's about 8%, and 92% of Americans live off of glucose. And in fact, the Center for Disease Control on their website shows that the average American will eat 150 pounds of sugar per annum, and with a sizable percentage eating 300 pounds of sugar per annum. That's almost a pound a day. So quite different. When you look at how wild animals eat, they capture something, they eat it, and they get an immediate glucose surge, and whether that's from the conversion of protein to glucose, or various organs like the liver has a lot of sugar in it. They will have a rise in their sugar, but then after a while, the rest of the whatever was digested is turned into fat, and then they live off of that fat to such a degree that they eat about once every 3 days. So, and our ancestors actually, primitive man ate very similar way. So they were always in this so-called metabolic flexibility. That is, they were going in and out of ketosis because there really are only two fuels that your body can use. One is ketones, which is a one carbon molecule, and the other is glucose, which is a six carbon molecule. And in order for that larger molecule to enter into mitochondria and become converted by the energy pill called mitochondria into ATP, it requires the influence of insulin. And many of you may actually know most of this. I'm just sort of reviewing it quickly. So what was interesting is that back in 1963, there was a guy named Ansel Keys. And Ansel Keys was a professor at Harvard who, interestingly enough, had published a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. And in that year, he basically conducted research that said that man should not be eating animal fats because it would increase the risk of stroke and heart attack. And that message was so profound that it became the mantra of Americans for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And as a result, we went into the so-called standard American diet, or the SAD diet, which was 50% carbohydrates, 40% protein, and 10% fats, the so-called low-fat diet. Within less than a decade, the slope of autoimmune diseases the slope of cancers, the slope of a variety of ills began to move upward to such a degree that by 2010, and in Time magazine, in fact, by the 1980s, fat was so vilified, and the cholesterol drugs came about, and and people were starting to actually get bigger and bigger. And this, I'm not really going to spend that much on the weight issue, but nonetheless, Americans became considerably heavier during those ensuing 20, 30, 40 years, mainly from a high carbohydrate diet. Along with the high carbohydrate diet, you developed elevated levels of insulin to pack away all that sugar, and insulin became known as a cellular toxin, such that high levels of insulin actually caused the release of over 85 different inflammasomes and at least 14, 15 different oncogenes, which are instruction sets to tell the nuclear DNA to start making tumor cells or having uncontrolled cellular reproduction. So, along with the studying of all this, several uh, scientists in the metabolic space had said, hey, maybe we ought to revisit the idea of what ancient man ate. And then so that became the basis for the so-called ancient man diet, then the carnivore diet, eating animal fats. Along with that came the revelation that Ansel Keys had actually lied on his and misrepresented his data in the New England Journal. And in fact, in that very same issue of the New England Journal of Medicine, about 4 or 5 pages back, was another scientist that actually had the reverse findings of his paper. Nonetheless, pharma at that time, and a guy named Gerald Raven, who was my endocrinology professor at Stanford in the medical school, had developed HMG CoA reductase inhibitors, and the first anti-cholesterol drug called Mevacor, which was extracted from red rice yeast. So there began a multi-billion-dollar operation of convincing America to start taking statin medications, control your lipids, eat a low-fat diet, high carbohydrate. And what ended up happening was sort of a fiasco of disease, which is where we are today, with obesity being at 70% according to the CDC, and not slowing down in any way, shape, or form. But nonetheless, a variety of people began to experiment with the so-called ketogenic diet to such a degree that in 2020, the most searched word in the Google search engine was the word keto. So we went about to develop exogenous ketones at a time when it was known that we could actually make a ketone that was biologically identical to the one that your body produces. So the ketones your body produces are acetoacetate, acetone, and beta hydroxybutyrate. And beta hydroxybutyrate is over 90% of the species of ketones in your circulating blood at any particular time. Although, if you're not metabolically flexible, or you're not doing ketosis either by exogenous means or dietary means or whatever, the amount of circulating ketone concentration is usually quite low. But having the metabolic flexibility that animals have, one began to see a remarkable change in a whole bunch of parameters of their bodies. That is, humans began to appreciate lower blood glucoses, improved insulin resistance, better hypertension, reduction of cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, and I'm going to show you some of that. Along that time, when I developed this, Stanley Ho and I developed the bioidentical ketones, we coined the word nutritional forgiveness because the diet can be so onerous to follow it's difficult to follow, and by drinking our ketones, you can actually enter ketosis in about 40 minutes as opposed to spending several days trying to reach there. And then even if you cheat and you go out and have a donut because you happen to have some craving, and rather than having to start over again, you can just drink our ketones and reestablish your ketosis pretty quickly. And in fact, in the early days, about now 10 years ago, I did a study on 100 and some odd patients, and they were taking our exogenous product twice a day, and they had an achieved weight loss of about 10 pounds per month. But what I did notice was that the inflammatory markers dropped like a stone. And people who had underlying inflammatory and autoimmune diseases came and showed me that their skin was getting better, their joint swelling was getting better, that they had more energy, that they had clear thought, that even when they looked out in the sky, colors seemed to be very brighter. And I think we were on that same discovery path, along with many other investigators across the world that began uh, originally to sort of poo-poo the idea of ketosis being of clinical value, because we were always taught to worry about diabetic ketoacidosis and ketone related comas in type 1 diabetics. But as the data became available, it was clear that ketosis actually was very important, an important part of cycling of energy in your body to prevent inflammation. And as a result, at the beginning, back when in 2010, when I was looking at this, major medical institutions had articles about how bad the ketogenic diet was for you. But within 2 or 3 years after that, all of those institutions, the biggest ones you can name, and I, in point in fact, remember that Harvard had a page on their medical school, on their medical website, which was talking about all the terrible things that could go wrong being on a ketogenic diet. But within a couple of years, they actually had their own division doing ketogenic research, and in fact doing ketogenic research on brain diseases and cancers, etc. And this little graph that you see here, it shows that ketosis has actually been with us since 1924, is when Dr. Wildy at Johns Hopkins gave an 8-year-old girl a ketogenic diet to control seizures. And since that time, over 100 years of ketone administration, both in oral form, intravenous form, even topical forms have been used for a variety of medical conditions. And so the safety profile of ketosis is actually quite convincing, and one should not worry about being in ketosis unless you're a type 1 diabetic or you are taking certain particular drugs. But I like to think of this whole idea of being metabolically flexible as sort of akin to a Toyota Prius, which is the picture on the left. Now, a Toyota Prius is a car that operates with a gasoline motor and an electric and a excuse me gasoline engine and an electric motor. And in between, they have a little CPU brain, a computer that determines when to turn on the gas and when to turn on the electricity, based on the ambient temperature, the driving style, the payload, and who knows what other factors. But the point is that Toyota did this with the idea of having the right propulsion unit for the right job. And as a result, the longevity of a Toyota Prius is actually quite longer than a traditionally powered gasoline car. However, there are some other sort of problems, right? So gas has got a lot of pollution, and it's sort of a dirty fuel, although it does produce a fair amount of energy. Whereas electricity is thought of as being clean, and so your body is sort of the same thing. The difference is that when you park your Prius at home, you shut the engine's off. While our bodies have this dual fuel system. And the dual fuel system was really to power the body during times of lack of food. But nonetheless, the brain and our cells actually do something. So when the ketone engine is running, the glucose engine is sort of quiescent, and it does something called autophagy, which in Greek means auto eating or self eating. And what it will do is cells will clean themselves out, throw out toxins, repair parts to promote the health of that system. Then the ketone engine spins up and the glucose engine spins down, and that segment of the energy production system does autophagy as well, and it promotes cleaning out these things. These inflammasomes go away, they repair the reactive oxygen species. A small amount is signaling, and there's all this cellular activity that actually promotes longer cellular well-being. So, so the role of ketones becomes much more magnified over the last 10, 15 years, to such a degree that when we started to wonder, well, why are all these diseases happening? Well, interesting. So people started doing radio labeled studies. They would give beta hydroxybutyrate labeled, and they would inject it into the blood and see where the heck it went. Well, interesting. If you think about it, there's a so-called teleologic reason why we have ketosis, other than as an energy source to propel you during periods when food is scarce. Where that radio labeled beta hydroxybutyrate went was fascinating. If you think about it, if you're hungry, what do you have to do to eat? You have to hunt. In order to hunt, you have to have the smarts to outwit your prey. You have to have muscular strength to outpower them. And you have to have cardiovascular endurance to make sure your cardiac output is high enough to have you endure the fight to kill this other animal and eat them, okay? So this is so-called teleologic application of ketones, and the radiolabel studies proved that radiolabeled ketones go to the brain, heart muscle, and skeletal muscle in preference to all other tissues first. Therefore, this makes sense that you can outfox, outendure, and outstrength your prey. And therefore, there are metabolic, cardiovascular, and neurologic benefits to ketones, which is now being explored. And if you see on the right, which I realize the print is a little small, so my classmate, Steve Finney, who's a class ahead of me in medical school, uh, coined the word nutritional ketosis. Nutritional ketosis, when the blood concentration of ketones is over 0.5, you are so-called in fat burning mode. But as science went on in the last 10 years, we found that higher levels of ketones actually portend to other benefits. And you can see them on the right, just a sample of what the literature has been able and science be able to do. That is, believe it or not, giving exogenous ketones actually encourages natural ketone production. There's anti-inflammasome reactions. T cells, which I'm very familiar with, have been documented to have 35% better killing power. Now, T cells are the things that kill HIV, COVID, the common cold, funguses, as well as cancer cells. There's synergism with chemotherapy and a so-called HDAC classification of chemotherapy drugs, which I can talk about at some other point. Uh, Metabolic improvement in terms of anti-aging effects, antioxidant effects, of course, the weight loss, as well as documented neurologic improvement. This is an example of a patient that I did on a clinical trial that we did about 7 or 8 years ago at Cedars. And this was presented at the American Society of Neurologists by Jethro Hugh, the principal investigator, and we as Keto 5 as a scientific sponsor. Patients had glioblastoma multiforme, which is a common cancer that killed Beau Biden, John McCain, and actually Jimmy Carter had it as well. But the median survival is with standard of care is 14 to 16 months. And in this patient here, there were two arms. One was standard therapy, and then standard therapy in addition to exogenous 3 times a day, plus, like I said, standard of care. And what we saw is this patient had a shrinkage in picture on the left brain side. That's the original tumor. And then at the end of I think it's 20 days or 21 days, we did a repeat showing a 75% reduction in volume. And by 144 days, the tumor was gone. And this gentleman went on to live, I think, over 5.5 or 6 years. So, and he was pretty compliant. These are our sort of contributions to science at the moment. This is a study that is done in a university where we are trying to measure blood flow in a artery. Now, if the artery is inflamed, it becomes stiff, and this stiffness can be measured by putting a blood pressure cuff and measuring the flow rates, okay, also called FMD. So what happens is patients were allowed to eat inflammatory foods like a giant hamburger, and then they were given 14 days of our exogenous product, and their flow rates improved, okay, in all but one. And we actually, when we looked at that one patient, we had suspicions about whether or not he was compliant with drinking the powder. But we published this data in a conference on May 25th of last year. And we can show essentially an indirect measurement of improvement of vascular inflammation. And this is the other end of it, looking at the peak velocity. So if the velocity goes down, that means the pipe got bigger and it's more flexible and less inflamed. And this study is a small cohort that we're actually increasing the number of patients to as a follow-up study so that we can reach statistical significance. But we expect the data to be consistent with our preliminary data. So inflammation, and that sort of segues into the idea of inflammation, which about 10, maybe no, actually 15 years ago now, a guy coined the word inflammaging and wrote the so-called 10 pillars of inflammation. And inflammation really is the arbiter of aging. And what was interesting is that even early studies of centurions across different cultures and across different continents and across time shows that centurions have something in common. When you measure their blood inflammation as simple as CRP or C-reactive protein, they're almost all virtually undetectable as centurions. And then when you look at what they're eating, it ends up to be mainly small amounts of meat, uh, fairly large amounts of greens, and fairly low amounts of carbohydrates. And so then people started looking at the idea, well, what is sugar doing to us? Well, sugar itself is not the problem. It's actually, believe it or not, the insulin. And insulin is unbelievably inflammatory, and it also changes the way your gut, what kind of bacteria grows in your gut. And there have been many, there's a big rise right now in the microbiome thing where people are having fecal transplants to cure inflammatory bowel diseases. And that's in an attempt to change the bowel population. And what's really fascinating, if you look in the literature, is that ketogenic diets as well as exogenous ketones actually change your microbiome to the better. Uh, and um, and in fact, it's what's interesting is that people who are highly carbohydrate dependent when they first take our product can sometimes get a fair amount of bloating and gastrointestinal distress simply because their bacteria are unable to consume ketones as an energy substrate, and they're so dependent on sugar that they actually start dying and they start producing gas, and as well as there's a natural tendency in exogenous ketones to bother the stomach. But I've sort of anecdotally reporting that patients who are highly carb dependent may have more GI issues than not. And of course, chronic disease, et cetera, which we can talk about. Nonetheless, because we, you know, because we have uh, uh, looked at these ideas of where the ketones are located in radio labeled studies, we began to do studies looking uh, at places where the ketones go, and you can find papers on cognitive function. You can find papers that have better metabolic efficiency, reduction of inflammation, better endurance, and that's what you see ketones major papers being published in. Uh, so this is all a result of, believe it or not, ATP. And ATP is the output product of the electron train transport system, electron transport chain system, where things like nutrients such as NAD and CoQ10 and things that we're now adding in to make this battery more efficient. But the sled, it's you can kind of think of it as a car assembly line. If you drop a glucose molecule in as opposed to dropping a ketone molecule in on the assembly plant and then adding these little parts in, the ejection of the amount of ATP that comes out of the end of the assembly line is about 40% higher than glucose. So not only are you getting greater energy, you're getting cleaner energy. And I think that's very important as far as your body's energetics are concerned. So, at the end of the day, we believe, and I think that the science cumulatively is demonstrating that we get better peak performance, better mental function. Uh, there's a million papers out there that talk about metabolic health related to optimized ketosis, and obviously reactive, ROS, reactive oxygen species, uh, although a small amount is necessary for signaling, larger amounts are quite deleterious. And because you have this clean fuel that's not inflammatory and having high ROS production, you end up protecting your cells and having a better well-being. So really at the end of the day here, way beyond weight loss, I've shown you, improved inflammasomes, reactive oxygen species reduction, improved cognitive ability, along with the weight loss and changing of the fat profile of your body, powering up your heart, reducing insulin or improving insulin sensitivity and reducing insulin resistance. And I think what we're seeing here is a new era where our ability to let me see if I can end this. There we go. I think at the end of the day, we're all looking for the same thing, that is better health in cells, longer life, and reduced inflammation. I think, hopefully I didn't go too long there.
You did a beautiful job. Thank you so much, Dr. Wall. I'm going to invite people to pop questions into the chat bar, but I'm going to start with one that was sent to me, and maybe you can kind of help that person. I know that they are actually online listening, so I'm sure they'll appreciate this question. So the question was, I have hypertension, diabetes, and congenital kidney issue.
Okay.
Would this be beneficial? Is their question. What kind of tests would I need to do in order to keep track of the effects on my conditions? And if there are already signs of kidney stones, is it better to avoid ketones?
Okay, so that's a incredibly common question. Many people uh, have, particularly as you get older, there's natural decline in renal function. Kidney stones are a known risk for uh, for ketogenic diets and exogenous ketones. However, I will say the following two or three things are important pieces of information that you need to obtain from your physician, and before you engage in using exogenous ketones. First is, there are certain types of kidney stones that form related to exogenous ketosis, as opposed to other kinds of kidney stones, which may be related to the way you eat. So, if you've had kidney stone, it's extraordinarily important to do a stone analysis. So, in my patient, anybody that, as a general internist, if someone had a stone, and forget about the fact they may or may not be on ketones, I make sure that they, pee through a sieve so I can capture that stone and send it off for analysis. Now, in terms of hypertension and uh, uh, your congenital kidney disorder, would depend on what congenital kidney disorder. That's probably the biggest uh, factor that you would need to clarify whether or not ketones can be useful. But for sure, hypertension will be improved. We have demonstrated not only that weight loss matters, but also that, as I said, your blood vessels become more flexible and less inflamed under ketosis, which generally provides lower blood pressure. What they call compliance of a blood vessel improves, that your blood vessel stretches easier under ketosis, as opposed to being a stiff pipe where the pressure goes up. So I think there's a little bit of detective work to do. You need to find out what kind of stone you had, and you need to discuss this. If you have your physician, um, certainly willing to, if they send me an email, mwool@keto5.com, I will try my best to answer a physician directed question to me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Appreciate that. So one question from a couple of people here is one of the people on the webinar this evening has used the product for the 3-day ketosis, the metabolic reset. Their question was, they were wondering about dosage and long-term use. Someone else was also wanting to wrap into that because they believe that you are supposed to stay on a keto diet for 6 months. So I'm not certain.
Well, okay, so when we talk about, in the earliest days of so-called ketogenic diet, it was really weight driven. But as thousands and thousands of people began to engage in this, in a ketogenic diet, there are other diets, including, the Atkins diet, and then you can cycle between them. But I think the most important concept is not necessarily the so-called classic ketogenic 70% fat diet. It is a diet that is low in carbohydrates and adequate proteins, along with weight bearing exercise to prevent muscle loss. And as long as you have adequate protein, or even if you go, semi uh, ketogenic and in semi Atkins, going back and forth, but keeping those carbs low, one of the best things that you can ask your doctor to do is measure your fasting insulin. Because in native animals, fasting insulin is between 0 and 2. Okay, but animals don't drive up, roll down their window, and have somebody throw burger, fries, and a Coke inside. Okay, they have to hunt. And in point in fact, they actually don't eat many fruits. Once in a while, they'll come upon an orange or an apple, but their carbohydrate consumption is low. So therefore, and the dissolution rate, the breakdown rate of a steak in their stomach or some other rabbit in their stomach dissolving is actually slow and slow enough such that the conversion by gluconeogenesis, uh, releasing sugar into the bloodstream from the rabbit, is actually so slow that it doesn't stimulate insulin. We have a problem in America. By eating all these carbs, you're flogging your pancreas to put out insulin. And I think that's, if you look at when the Ansel Keys manipulation of public thought with his paper, and you look at the curve of pancreatic cancer, prostate cancer, and breast cancer, they have a takeoff point about 8 years after the institution of the so-called SAD diet. I think that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. So another question would be, could this help menopausal women who wake up in the night from the liver dumping glucose? Could they take it before bed to help stabilize blood sugar so sleep is better? And the additional one was, would it be beneficial before a workout or after?
Okay, so in terms of the the menopausal symptomology, first of all, taking ketones at night will almost always keep you awake. One of the earliest things that happened to me as I was developing the product with Stanley is I took it about 10:30 at night and I watched the sunrise. I mean, it was unbelievable. I was like, I could not go to sleep, and I was so alert. And really, you think about it, a lot of animals are very alert at night, because if they're starving and they're alert at night, they actually have, some of them hunt at night, right? So, um, I don't recommend that. But that being said, being in ketosis, okay, is will help you sleep better. Now, will it reduce the sweats and the changes? I couldn't tell you. There are a few papers, that talk about the mitigation of some menopausal symptoms in patients who are in long-term stable ketosis. But usually it's a higher level in the daytime, so they can have it at night. So it might actually be, in point in fact, the reduced insulin levels, which actually may have a better effect than the actual ketone itself. In terms of exercise, ketones have been one of the very first indications for exogenous ketones was in the high performance sports market. The best story I can tell you about this was in the 2015 Tour de France. Uh, there was a guy who had run the race maybe 5 or 6 times, and he was a middle of the roader. The Tour de France is 1,000 guys riding 1,000 miles. That's essentially what it is. And this guy that was constantly placing in the 500, a middle of the roader, was ended up being in second. And you know, of course, the stewards said, hey, you got to be doping, or you got to be on drugs, or you got to be doing something. So, they basically took him apart. They sampled his hair, his urine, his blood, his fingernails, and all this, looking for some kind of performance enhancer. And guess what happened? They showed, the guy said, I don't do anything. And they found nothing. He says, well, you got to be doing something. He says, well, for the past year, I have been training under ketosis with a physician who understood sports physiology. And in fact, way before then, the Ethiopians outran us in the marathon in the Olympics. Why? Because they're hunter gatherers. They live on ketosis. They run 20 miles, nothing, because they've got a fat supply that is enduring. So
Perfect.
yes, performance, absolutely.
Mhm. I was just wondering, listening to you, if you've got people who do night work and have to be at work at night, is it beneficial to help them cycle through that?
Yes. So, in answer to that is absolutely, and I have recently done a study. So I actually am an internist and an intensive care physician by formal training, and so all of my so-called peers are guys that live like night owls. We all take shifts at 2, 3 in the morning. And instead of drinking Red Bull or Celsius or Monster, we drink exogenous. And you get a much cleaner level of alertness. You don't have that dragged out hangover feeling later on. And you don't have to drink tons of caffeine. The FDA recommendation for caffeine max is 400 milligrams per day. That's the FDA recommendation. So a typical Monster has over 100 milligrams of caffeine. In fact, some of them, I don't remember which ones, but I have a little chart. They're all really high. And not only that, Red Bull has 32 grams of glucose in it.
Yeah,
This is
great answer.
providing you clean energy. Remember, your brain actually likes ketones. It's a pure energy. There's a diff. I want to make something very importantly clear here. There's a difference between a stimulant and source of energy. Ketones are your body's energy. You make ketones even without any of our product or anything. You get up in the morning and you pee on a ketone stick, and it will turn light purple because at night you make ketones. And if you didn't eat for 3 days, you'd have a lot of ketones, which is, by the way, the average feeding cycle of a wolf in Alaska, every 3 days, because he's living off his fat. So at the end of 3 days, his ketone level is really high. You go out and you do the 3 day metabolic reset, and your ketones will be high, period, with or without our product. But with our product, you'll feel a lot better. You won't have the keto flu. You will mitigate a lot of these, transformation of the metabolic switch. Metabolic switch can be very sort of onerous. It makes you achy, it makes you tired, especially if you're a high carbohydrate hooked kind of human.
So the other question would be, would you use ketones after a meal to bring down the blood sugar faster? I think you kind of mentioned that.
Yeah, I think that bringing down the blood sugar really fast is ketones aren't actually going to per se do that. What does it is the surge of insulin. Okay, and there used to be you guys can look this up. It's called a Simoji effect. In the old days, there was a guy professor by the name of Simoji, and there was something called rebound hypoglycemia, which was sort of a phenomenon in the late 70s to the mid 80s. And people would say, "Oh, I have hypoglycemia," and what happens is, at first it was sort of poo-pooed, and institutions said, "No, that's not true." And later on, they found, well, no, it actually is true. You go out and eat a Snicker bar, and you look at forget about looking at your glucose level. You look at your insulin level. Your insulin level rockets up, and it overshoots. So let's see if I can draw this on the screen right. Your insulin goes up, right, and your sugar plunges, and the insulin takes a while to slow down, so you start bottoming out your sugar. So, these things are not light switches. Remember, you have machinery that has to release the insulin, and it doesn't, it's not like a light switch. You got to slow it down. You remove the glucose stimulant, and then it takes a time for the insulin to regulate itself. So the curve doesn't look like this. It looks like this.
Yep. Question, would these help preserve muscle when doing an extended fast?
No, no. You need to eat protein. You need to eat protein, and you need to eat, and excuse me, and you need to do weight-bearing exercises.
Okay, perfect. How many can you use in a day?
Three doses the maximum. Now, that being said, let me just put some caveats to this. A while back, I noticed that in particularly people who have medical issues that we are trying to improve. We know that, like I said, Steve Finney, the guy 1 year ahead of me in school, came up with nutritional ketosis. And that is 0.5 on a blood meter, like a keto mojo meter. And that means you're in fat burning mode. But this so-called signaling, which is turning down the reactive oxygen species, improving neural conduction down a neuron, improving reflex time, looking at your colorimetric. People actually report seeing brighter colors under ketosis. And that's because the speed of conduction and the power down the electrical line, your neurons, is so much more improved with the 40% more ATP. So the answer is we can adjust that by using our so-called ATAC bottle, which is a bottle that has a squeeze on it, and it has two cylinders. One is the reservoir, and the other is the dosing cylinder. So you squeeze it, and when patients come to my office, I will say, start out with 15 mLs. But in patients that have glioblastoma or lupus or ankylosing spondylitis, or they may need a ketone number that is much higher. I will get them to 5 for cancer. So the reason why we named the company Keto 5 is because I want your ketones between 0.5 and 5.0. And I want your A1C to be 5 and below.
Beautiful. Great way to
With two
remember.
fives.
I have a question here. What are the ingredients?
Okay, so the ingredients are all they're, first of all, they're GMO, they're kosher. uh, and what are they made of? Okay, so beta hydroxybutyrate is actually a manufactured uh, molecule which is identical to what your body makes. And we then attach ions to it: magnesium, calcium, sodium, potassium, in the exact ratios that your body makes them. So when you drink the drink, the magnesium or the calcium separates off of the beta hydroxybutyrate and leaves the beta hydroxybutyrate to be absorbed by the cell. And the magnesium So the mix that's a result of the dissolution is actually in the same percentage that it exists in your body.
Mhm.
That's why we call it bioidentical.
Right. Thank you.
Now, we do have a low sodium version, which is for people who, and I think what's important to make a point here is that not all hypertensive people are sodium restricted people. This was as a result of many years of the cardiology community saying they used to tell everybody they had hypertension, low sodium. Well, somebody actually went and challenged that, and they went and reviewed patients, and there are certain patients that can actually take sodium without getting more swollen, having hypertension, etc. So there are patients that have hypertension by other mechanisms of action rather than having sodium. So for those that have a sodium restriction, we have our Exo Ultra and our Exo Immune product, which are sodium free. Okay. So nonetheless, the amount of magnesium, calcium, and potassium that are in there are still the correct ratios.
We have a question. Somebody said that you mentioned an if one has type 1 diabetes, do not use ketones. What would you suggest for someone with high blood pressure at age 75 that I suspect has metabolic issues but not diagnosed as a type 1 at this time?
Well, type 2 diabetics can easily be managed using exogenous ketones. In fact, there's many papers, we can give you one, where patients with type 2 diabetes are had their, A1Cs drop tremendously after, nine months of exogenous ketones. So it's very common. I think you'll see that there are most physicians sort of understand, and that's why the ketogenic diet became popular. Remember, the difference between a ketogenic diet and us as an exogenous ketone supplier is that you have to eat rigorously to get where you want to get to. Whereas with us, you can have a little more, and I call it, and I coined it, nutritional forgiveness. You can cheat a little bit. You can have more of a civil life, if that's the way you want to look at it. I mean, you can't be Homer Simpson and eating a donut 50 times a day, but you can do, you can have a slice of pizza, once in a while. But
Sorry.
it just sort of allows you some luxury to get compliant, to have a little more energy, to get you through keto flu, and then later on as a maintenance. Because I'm going to tell you one other thing. The reason, if you look at the GLP drugs, the injections, Wegovy, um, Ozempic, Manjaro. What's the facts on this? Well, America is a very sort of quick solution country. Take a shot, lose weight. Stop the shot, gain weight. So really, let's actually look at that. The best study is published in Obesity Magazine in October of 2024. And 38,300 patients followed out in 7 years in 10 different healthcare organizations. That's a lot of patients. That's a lot of time. And what are the conclusions? First, 43% of patients get one of the top 5 side effects: nausea, vomiting, fatigue, diarrhea, cramps. All right. Not the rare things, which are, paralyzed bowel trying to require removal of your stomach. That's rare. Okay. It does happen, but it's rare. Diarrhea, bloating, cramps, fatigue, and nausea. 43%. Now, of those who start on a GLP-1, only 23% actually achieve target weight. 23%. That means 77% fail to get to target weight. Of the 23% that get to target weight, 63% gain 100% of the weight back in 40 weeks upon cessation of product. Now, why is this? Because we didn't change anything in you. We gave you a shot, it shut off your hunger. You stopped the shot because either one, your insurance company told you you can't have any more of this. B, you got tired of paying too much for it. Okay. And C, you dropped out because you had a side effect. So those people who dropped out, they went back to eating the way they did. But through our health coach systems and the people who are experts at training you, it's like, okay, if you go to a motion picture theater and you walk in and you watch a movie and you're in the dark and you're experiencing everything as a movie, the storytelling, the music, the lights, the director, the dialogue. I now take you out of the theater and I send you to film school where you learn about dialogue, film directing, camera movements, and everything else, right? I now send you back to the motion picture theater. You're never, ever going to see a movie the same way. You will sit there and think, oh, I don't like that music or that dialogue's not right. So when our health coaches teach you proper diet, timing of eating, quantity of eating, supported by our products, it becomes second nature to you. You're you're altered again. And as long as you become cognizant, at the beginning, you don't know how many calories are in 3 ounces of beef. But, now you eyeball it, says, well, I'm on a 1,200 calorie restricted diet. I can have this size beef. And your whole perspective of life is literally changed by going through one of our programs. And I think that and we can show that the recidivism rate, the fallout rate is much lower than someone who gets a shot and then the shot stops because they ran out of money, their program, or they had a side effect. Because all you do is you go back to eating your donuts and you're back to square one. That makes sense to y'all?
Yeah. So question was, how long can this product be taken, and do we need to buy the sticks to make sure we're staying in ketosis?
Uh, okay, so I, of course, would like you to be taking this forever. But in reality, most people, I will tell you, most people lose 20, 30 pounds and then they buy them and keep them in their purse or, in their cupboard and say, I'm going to a baby shower tonight and I don't want to eat all that cake. Or I'm going to be attending whatever, something that has a lot of carbs at it. Or I want to touch myself up. But usually people take it continuously, probably, well, I have patients that continuously took it for, 3/4 to a year because they were really heavy. They were like, 200 pounds overweight. And those people will take it for a long time. But for the average person who, wants to get into swimsuit weather or whatever, but what ends up happening is people sort of get trained. There's a degree of behavior modification of which the importance cannot be overemphasized. And then you use our product as you need it once you go, because you've sort of learned everything, right? But
So
there's not, by the way, there is no harm to take it forever. There is no
And that's
harm to
kind of
the liver.
what I was excited about was the long-term
Yeah.
longevity benefits.
Remember, we are giving you something your body actually manufactures, and it is molecularly identical to what you make.
Come back to the weight loss piece. If you lose weight on this, which obviously a lot of people would love to do, and that may be their focus, and you stop, are you automatically going to see a quick rebound? Do you have to stay on a calorie restriction for this to work?
Okay, so when we talk about the basics of weight loss, you know, uh, it's 35 kcals per kilogram per day. For every accumulated 3,500 calories of that you accumulate, you either gain 1 pound or you lose 1 pound. And that's pretty stable no matter what animal you are. We take dogs in the lab and we just calorie restrict them. The difference between calorie restriction on a carb, and this, by the way, has actually been published, and we have the paper. If people are reducing weight through ketosis as opposed to reducing weight just by calorie restriction, you actually see radically different outcomes in terms of uh, cholesterol, triglyceride, uh, other metrics of the body, even including more subtle measurements like performance on cognitive testing. So if you lose 20 pounds by ketosis and you lose 20 pounds by restricting calories, there's going to be a slightly subtle difference in the performance of certain kinds of cognitive testing, executive function testing. Actually, the best is probably reflex testing. Your reflexes will be faster in ketosis. And that goes back to survival benefit. Remember, the animal that's in ketosis, that's hungry, is much faster, much smarter, and much stronger.
Mhm. We have one other question here on how many carbs can you consume and still stay in ketosis if you're using the product?
Easily, if you want to be really onerous, 20 grams a day. But if you don't, I think once you lose your weight and, I tell patients you can lighten up to about 50 grams, a day and maybe even 60 or 75 once in a while. But if you do that all day long, you'll lose your ketosis enzymes and you have to start over again. You don't want to do that. So I wouldn't eat a high carb diet for like 5 days in a row. That would sort of throw you out.
So just using the product is not the magic bullet. In other words, just use this, don't change anything in your life, and you'll lose weight.
Yeah, for weight loss, it's really about calories. Remember, you have a storehouse in your body. If you're 30 pounds overweight, cutting it off, which we have tried in bariatric surgery, is horribly complicated with terrible outcomes. So the only way to get it off is to burn it off. The only way to burn it off is to eat a hypocaloric diet. But if you want to be and have the benefits of ketosis as opposed to just burning it off with a hypocaloric carbohydrate-based diet, then you're going to get much better benefits. You're going to feel a lot more alert. You're not going to be as sluggish. You're going to have, better sleep habits, etc. So I mean, whoever designed us right, okay? And animals, I think animals that are eating, every 3 days. That's why intermittent fasting, by the way, came about. Intermittent fasting is America's answer to try and mimic a wild animal because they understand those original studies that looked at the absence of disease in animals that spend 60 to 80% of their lives in ketosis is a real thing. I mean, they didn't have a choice to go, uh, to McDonald's.
That's so
So you
true.
would say, Dr. Wool, that exogenous ketones help with those hunger hormones so that you
Oh,
could eat
yeah,
less
for
calories.
sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. There's no doubt. But when, again, Finney proved that when you get into 0.5 beta hydroxybutyrate blood levels, you're going to turn off ghrelin. There's all kinds of papers on that. That's old news.
So we have one pertinent question. How do we get this?
Well, you gotta talk to Val about that, and you gotta talk to Carolyn about that. I think Dr. Hoffman is joining our network and is going to be I think a point person here. So I think as time goes on, I'm not sure where you are in the network paperwork, but
No, we're set
we're
up and ready to go. We're going to, so for people who are interested, this is something that they can reach out. I'll put some links into the chat so that you can reach out if you're interested in the product, just in general for your health. Valeria and I have been talking about, we're going to be scheduling a 3-day metabolic reset. Which will be around the 27th of, we're going to have an event on the 27th of May to discuss what that would be. And then you can do the 3-day. People do that and then kind of play around with things, but you can then move into a 14-day program to get into a space if the weight loss piece is part of what you want. I've been playing around with this and using this now, just in terms of, what does it feel like to be on this and not necessarily focus on the weight loss piece, but it's really interesting. You made the comment about taking it late at night, Dr. Woolen, being up. And I had a few nights ago when I actually couldn't sleep all night. It wasn't because of anything to do with the ketones, because I don't think I even took them on that day. But I was like, I didn't even get sleep till 5:30 in the morning. And I think I slept for like 2.5 hours. And I had clients coming in for long sessions. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I'm going to be dragging by the time we're working through this in the afternoon. And I took the ketones in the morning and I got to the end of the day and I was like, that's interesting. Never noticed a wig of exhaustion.
yeah.
Still was up at 11 o'clock at night. Was sharp all the way through, and yeah, definitely
You probably had a
very
good
very
night's
helpful.
sleep afterwards.
I did, but what was interesting was I didn't notice the drag and the exhaustion of being up all day without very little sleep, and that goes to that point that you were saying.
That's right, and that's why the guys in the ICU at Cedars and at UCLA, they drink our product pretty consistently. I think shift
Interesting.
workers, if you're a person, who's a police officer or in the paramedic and ambulance driver, or these
There's
guys are.
actually a blog with an Uber driver who works all night long who talks about using ketones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, there is one question I would like to ask, because I know that we have someone here that it is pertinent to them. You mentioned that you've been using this obviously for the glioblastoma.
Mhm.
Talk to us though to close out the questions, and really appreciate all your time here. If you have someone who's in an active cancer situation and they've lost a lot of weight, as is traditional with so many cancer situations, how do you handle that? Because we're talking about using it for metabolic flexibility and burning off calories, but if you've got someone who does not need to lose any weight,
Yeah.
how do we handle that, and is it appropriate for them?
So first of all, the answer is yes. You can definitely adjuvantly use ketones as part of a cancer management strategy. It requires someone who's actually pretty skilled at
Right.
doing it. You can't. The vast majority of oncologists um, will tell you the simple reason: no sugars, and that is from Otto Warburg's the Warburg effect, which was for which he won a Nobel Prize in 1926. Again, a testament to the idea that ketones have been used medicinally for some time now. But remember about when I talked to you about teleology. The reason why your body's losing weight is because it wants to be in ketosis, because cancer cells don't live in ketogenic blood very well, the vast majority of them. Because cancer cells require sugar to grow. It's called a high glycolytic index. So to make it simple to understand, cancers require sugar to grow. And the same is you people hear people like starve or cold, right? Same thing. After Otto Warburg discovered that cancer cells require sugar to live and that the absence of sugar in the body causes cancer cells to die, that's why the body's trying to starve itself. So it will eat itself up in an effort to keep the sugar down and provide the body with ketones. That's principally one of the reasons. So, in order to manage that situation, unfortunately, you actually have to eat a real ketogenic diet. You don't want to mess around with this. So, you want to have, and there's a guy named Thomas Seyfried, Seyfried. Thomas Seyfried came up with a principle looking at the idea of having what is called the GKI, the glucose ketone index. And you can read his paper or you can watch his YouTube. It works off of Otto Warburg's principle of starving the tumor. So you want to achieve a GKI index of 1 or less. And you can read the formula on how to do that. So you need to add your calories. So I recommend, let's just say we do the math. Let's say the person's weighing 50 kilos. Okay. If they're 50 kilograms, you multiply times 35. That gives you your total caloric daily requirement to maintain your weight. So I'm just going to make this up. Let's say it's 2,000 calories. So at 2,000 calories, you want 70% of those calories to come from fat. So 7 times 2 is 1,400 of those calories got to come from fat. And, 5% from carbs and the rest from protein and doing weight training. If you do that, you will maintain your weight. Let's say you're lost weight from chemotherapy and you want to gain weight. Well, raise it to 2,500 calories or 3,000 calories to eat. And maybe you don't feel like eating like that. Okay, because so then you got to look at the idea of, well, maybe you should stimulate your appetite by smoking marijuana or something like that, or some appetite stimulants or Megace. So there's a lot of management tricks, but and by the way, you can get ketogenic tube feedings. You can get ketogenic drinks in terms of protein fat ratios, food supplements. So there are, those are principally used in the pediatric population to control seizures. So, and they make it in vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. So there are ways to manage this. But being in ketosis is important. Now, that being said, the reality is over time, cancer cells get smart and they start to use ketones to live off of. So then ketogenic diets become less effective, or exogenous ketones products become less effective. But for a period of time, they're very, very effective. And the witness is the guy that I showed you his glioblastoma multiforme. In 20 days, it shrunk 75%. And when I was doing a trial with the neuro-oncologist, he sends me this CT scan I showed you. I go, well, so what? He's on chemo and radiation. He says, well, that's not the point. The point is that under circumstances of conventional chemotherapy and conventional radiation, the normal shrinkage rate is 35%, and ours shrunk 75%, or between 65 and 75 because of the volume measurements in the MRI CT scanner. But he says that's remarkable. That's really different. So we have something here. So, and if you look at the paperwork now, hundreds of patients are being treated with exogenous ketones and ketogenic diets for glioblastoma multiforme and living longer. And some of them have been, long-term survivals. So, I mean, there are lots and lots of anecdotal trials. The problem is that it's difficult to do trials with rare diseases because you need a certain number to make statistical significance and so on and so forth. Anyway, any other questions?
I think not. We want to say thank you so much for your generosity and your time and the information. I'm sure that people got a huge amount from this. I mean, it's I've only sat and listened to you a couple of times now, but it's really still good to keep listening. There's so many other things that can come out of this. I have 2 links in the chat bar there. If people want more information, there's a form they could fill out, and I'll get back to them with that so that I know. And then if they're interested in either doing the 3-day metabolic reset with us, or they want to just get going on the product, do the client registration form, and we'll take it from there and we'll reach out to you. And I want to thank you all, everyone, for being here. And thank you again so much, Dr. Wolf, for all your time.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to address you all. And, I think this is a very bright future for this type of maneuver and diets, etc.
Well,
all right.
And we'll get this recording out to
Great
everybody that
weekend.
registered. Yeah, thanks a lot. You too. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.